All right. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on from where you are listening. My name is Martin Krag. I'm the head of the Russia in Eurasia program with the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and it is my great pleasure and honor to host today's webinar. Again, it's an unusual format for many of us. We are adapting and learning how to use these digital tools. But it's important that we are able to continue discussing topics that are happening in the outside world. Elections in Eastern Europe is the title of today's webinar, and there's a lot of activity going on in many of the countries that we tend to call we nowadays call the Eastern Partnership countries. In Georgia on October 31st, there were parliamentary elections. And although many of you may have read more in the news about the state of Georgia in the US presidential election, the election in Georgia, the country, will actually mean a lot for the development in the region as well. And earlier this year, we had a presidential election in Belarus that is hotly contested. And we have seen the biggest rise in civil society activity in Belarus in many, many years, if not historically. Also, before that, in 2019, there were presidential election in Ukraine, where Zelensky, previously a politician coming from the outside of the political system, becoming president with a large mandate from the people. But with us today here now to talk, and we will focus mostly on Georgia, but also the broader region today, we have Buziashvili. She is a researcher with the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. She is based in Tbilisi, following the events closely. Also based in Tbilisi is Givi Silagadze, who is an analyst with the Georgian Institute of Politics, my apologies. And last but not least, my colleague from Uppsala University, Ekman, who is a PhD candidate in political science. Givi, would you like to commence by giving us a sort of an overview of the elections and the development in Georgia?
Thank you very much, Martin. I would like to thank the Institute for organizing this webinar discussion. It's very timely and very interesting, and I'm very happy to be part of this discussion. So in order to make sense of the Georgia's political landscape, we have to keep in mind at least two major parties in Georgia, and I will briefly mention those two parties, which is one, the United National Movement, which is in opposition now. It came to power in 2003 after the bloodless Rose Revolution, and Georgian Dream. This is another party which came to power in 2012. In 2012, Georgia registered first peaceful transition of power in Georgia's history. So since 2012, Georgian Dream Party is ruling party and the United National Movement is in opposition. So as for the 2020 parliamentary elections, there were many hopes that Georgia will reaffirm its path to become a consolidated democracy. But this is questionable now. According to the official results announced by the Central Electoral Commission of Georgia, in total 9 parties passed the threshold and will be represented in the parliament. The current ruling party, which is Georgian Dream Party, got 48% of the votes. And the United National Movement, the largest and the electorally strongest opposition party, got 27% of the votes. But it's important to assess how was the election held. Well, there are two dimensions here. So one is the epidemiological situation, and the other is how fair and free it was. In terms of the pandemic, the elections were administered quite successfully, I would say, without any major failures. But as for the other part, to what extent it was fair, free, and competitive, there are many questions and issues. For instance, OSCE preliminary report pointed out that there were very important irregularities during the election process, but the elections were competitive and fundamental rights were largely respected. the US Embassy and the European Union representation in Georgia also relied on the OSCE report and said that the efforts to corrupt the election process was very significant, unacceptable, but these efforts were not sufficient to invalidate the results. So what does the official results mean? The issue is that the current ruling party took 48%, as I said, the identical percentage that it got in 2016 parliamentary elections. And this means that it will be able, also means that, that the Georgian Dream party will remain in power for another 4 years. This results, so this is a novel phenomenon in Georgia. It will be novel phenomenon in Georgia, that the political party will stay in power for more than 2 terms. It would be unprecedented. For instance, in 2003, then ruling party Union of Citizens tried to stay for the 3rd term, but what it got was the Rose Revolution and the United Nations movement came to power. I'm not trying to draw parallels between the current situation and the 2003 elections in terms of election conduct. And I do not want to speculate that it is likely that the situation will unfold in the similar manner and will got revolution. But what I want to show is that there has not been a precedent in Georgia when one party managed to retain power for an extended period. So what's the current situation in Georgia now, the political situation? Each and every political party other than the Georgian Dream party claims that the election and the parliament lacks legitimacy due to large-scale election fraud, pressure on voters, candidates, and journalists. So the current political landscape, we could say, that is divided between the Georgian Dream party and all the other political players. So we have just 2 camps. The opposition organized as a result of the elections, so as a response to the election, the opposition organized the large-scale street demonstrations, and they claim that they are trying to protect votes. All the opposition parties demand a new parliamentary election, but only after the resignation of the head of the Central Electoral Commission. So you might ask, what do these opposition parties have to say about the OSCE report and statements of the US Embassy and the EU representation in Georgia, which basically said that the election results should not be invalidated? So opposition's argument is that OSCE had a limited observation mission due to the pandemic. Therefore, the full picture of irregularities was not resembled in their preliminary report. So now the opposition tries to gather evidence of this large-scale electoral fraud and to persuade the public, experts and international community that those irregularities sort of affected the final result significantly. Yesterday, there was a dialogue between the ruling party and the opposition at the venue of the Embassy of US in Tbilisi. Its first round, of course, yesterday's round did not deliver any tangible results, but the dialogue will continue and we'll have to wait if the parties will manage to come to an agreement. So to sum up, first, what all this mean? First, the 2020 parliamentary elections was clearly a step back in terms of democratization, regardless of what the opposition or the ruling party say. There were more irregularities now than in 2016 parliamentary election. Only the fact that all the opposition parties are not going to enter the parliament because it's not legitimate in their view could be an indication that something is deeply wrong. Second, without the help of Georgia's partners, political sides are not able to communicate with each other in a civilized manner. And this might be an indication of lack of political culture at this moment. Therefore, the hopes that by holding 2020 parliamentary elections, Georgia will reaffirm its path towards consolidated liberal democracy were fundamentally undermined, I would say. I don't want to take too much time. I will stop here and wait for your questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Eto, maybe you could fill in and provide some other dimensions to this broad picture that Givi provided us.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be joining you in this very important conversation. I'll draw attention to more the information dimension of the elections and how it was going on during the pre-election period. So the pre-election period, the political situation in Georgia was increasingly and extremely polarized. which was fueled by various disinformation campaigns, both domestic and Russian one. But one of the main things here was that the far-right political groups and parties were one of the biggest actors in these elections. Far-right, pro-Russian and anti-Western political parties have become noticeably active both online and offline prior to parliamentary elections. And they have been spreading anti-Western and pro-Russian disinformation in an attempt to influence the choice of Georgian society on the 31st of October. Here comes the role of Facebook, and this social media plays crucial role in Georgia because the majority of Georgians are presented on Facebook. They are getting daily information on Facebook, and that's why both domestic and foreign actors are choosing Facebook to spread disinformation and to help some influence operations. To briefly talk about far-right groups, and there have been asked the question if there was Russian interference or not. And I would say yes, and it was connected to these far-right groups, which has the direct link with Russia. For example, according to a report by Estonian intelligence service, one of the far-right parties that have been operating in Georgia and participating in elections has a direct links with the Kremlin. The name of this party is Georgian March. Another big party, which first gained its first six seats in Georgian parliamentary elections back in 2016, it's an alliance of patriots. They have been accused of working for Russia against the interest of Georgia by targeting NGOs and civil society, media, and pro-Western political parties. So there was a very interesting investigation in the pre-election period, basically 2 months before elections, by Dossier Center, that this party is directly financed by the Kremlin, which is also handling the party's election campaigns. And here is where the Russian interference and foreign interference issue comes. So how this party operates, they have been operating both online on Facebook and offline, installing some anti-Western and anti-Turkish banners. So this party have been very famous in Georgia for its Turkophobic disinformation, because they attempt to distract attention from the threat of Russia to Turkey and say that Turkey is the same occupying force and the same existential threat for Georgia as Russia is. So basically, this party have been installing some anti-Turkish banners in the streets of Georgia. They also have been they also have been financing political ads on Facebook, targeting thousands, tens of thousands Georgian citizens. And the main goal was to influence their choice on elections and spread these anti-Western narratives, and to make people not vote for pro-Western parties. But there were also some other far-right groups that were operating online. For example, some of them were attempting to present themselves as a trusted source for news and analysis. So there is a far-right group, Alt-Info, which is quite popular in Georgia, and they are spreading and sowing distrust of the West and incite anti-LGBT sentiments in country in an effort to push for its anti-Western political agenda. And their activities were particularly concerning ahead of parliamentary elections, during which, as I told you, several anti-Western parties were competing for the votes of Georgians. And last but not least, as you might know, Facebook is conducting takedowns all over the world, and Georgia has been one of the countries where 3 takedowns happened in the pre-election period. Takedown means when Facebook deletes some pages, groups, or assets which are conducting coordinated inauthentic behavior. It means that some groups are working together to mislead others about who they are or what they are doing. So 2 out of 3 takedowns were connected to ruling Georgian Dream. It means that they were trying to spread some narratives to artificially influence the choice of Georgians. And the third takedown was related to this far-right political party, Patriots, Alliance of Patriots. And these networks were really large. They were trying to spread the anti-Western narratives, basically say that if Georgia joins NATO, it will lose two of its occupied regions, and that, for example, if Georgia joins EU or NATO, the whole country will become. So they were trying to fuel some anti-LGBT sentiments as well. But also they have been using COVID-19 related situation to fuel some negative emotions and to kind of engage as many people as possible. So the information dimension has become really, really important during these elections.
Sorry, I'm an amateur still. I begin talking without unmuting myself. Eto, I would just like to ask you with a follow-up question. How important do you think these activities in social media were in influencing the election outcome? Is that an increasing important aspect of Georgian politics, or is it still marginal, the people who are exposed to these, particularly the disinformation campaigns?
Yeah, I would say that the social media and information dimension is playing the crucial role in Georgia right now. There was a very interesting poll by NDI. Basically, one of the questions went like, do you think that you are getting daily information on Facebook? And the majority of people said no. So basically their answer was that if they do not see the link to the website with the news, they don't think that they are getting information on Facebook. They don't think that some memes or pictures or videos or some statuses might be influencing their choice. And this is where we have a problem. This is where these bad actors are trying to leverage with that. And so, for example, I mentioned these takedowns, and the majority of these actors were trying to have this entertainment content. They were camouflaging themselves as some entertainment Facebook pages or groups, and that's how they were spreading this anti-Western or pro-Russian disinformation campaigns. So basically, I would say that it plays a crucial role. Okay, the far right saw the big defeat in these elections, and I would say that this is because civil society, international organizations worked hard to present the threat of far right to people. And I would say that it was success, that this far right now, they have 2 or 3 seats only in parliament. But it doesn't mean that they won't change their operational tactics. They, of course, they are developing with us. They are seeing all our researches. They are seeing how we're exposing them, and they are developing. So the threat of far right and openly pro-Russian parties will remain one of the greatest challenges for Georgia.
Thank you very much for the sort of fill-in of the details. I would also like to remind the audience, the people listening in, that you can write to the in the comments on the chat function questions that you would like to pose to us here in the panel. But last but not least, Per, I would like you to provide us your perspective on the elections and the region.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for inviting me. So my goal today is to put the recent Georgian elections into context with other recent elections in Eastern Europe, such as Ukraine and Belarus. What similarities and differences can we see, and what does it say about the state of democracy in the region? We can start with a ranking from 2020 by Freedom House called Nations in Transit. It measures freedom and democracy in Eastern Europe. And if you look at the 6 countries that belong to EU's Eastern Partnership, we can see that there are 3 frontrunners, if you will. Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova in that order. These 3 countries are all described by Freedom House as hybrid regimes, thus not fully democratic, but not fully authoritarian. And they are also the 3 countries that are closest to the EU in terms of integration. Then we have Armenia, not far behind these 3, especially after the Velvet Revolution in 2018. Way behind these four countries, we find Belarus and Azerbaijan, who are described as consolidated authoritarian regimes by nations in transit. And obviously, we will have to wait and see what will happen in Belarus now. And this ranking doesn't take recent events in 2020 into consideration, including the Georgian elections. So it's important to keep that in mind. But that is one way to look at where we are today from a comparative angle. Secondly, I would like to add that when it comes to prospects of democratization in the region, we can say that international experts were very optimistic, perhaps in the 1990s, that it would evolve quite easily, but increasingly skeptical from the early 2000s, I would say, if we look at the region as a whole. I think today there are more nuanced expectations and an understanding that there is not always a linear process toward democracy. And instead, as the American scholar Henry Hale has argued, the process can sometimes instead be described as regime cycles, moving back and forth between more democratic and more authoritarian kind of regime. At least that's what it looks like, but yeah, it's not a linear process. And I think also scholars increasingly remember that it can be unfair also to compare countries that for like only 30 years ago were part of the Soviet Union to compare them with Western Europe, since the democratization processes in Western Europe have been ongoing for several hundreds of years. So it's important to keep in mind what we are comparing with. Still, I mean, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be critical, of course, and analyze it. So the point is that the road toward democracy is certainly not guaranteed. It's not a one-way street, and it can backslide. So if you look at the comparison of recent elections in Georgia, Ukraine, and Belarus, it's clear that in Ukraine and Belarus, the people rejected the old elite. I was personally in Ukraine in 2018, only 6 months before the presidential election, and everyone I talked to believed it would be a political battle between the president at the time, Petro Poroshenko, and Yulia Tymoshenko. So both were had a long experience in Ukrainian politics. But as you mentioned in the beginning, Martin, Volodymyr Zelensky entered the race almost from nowhere. He had a clever campaign and won in the second round with a stunning 73% of the votes. And Zelensky was a new face with no political baggage whatsoever and no political experience, which many argue has also been a problem. But many Ukrainians voted for him, and I think they did so primarily because they were not happy with what the old political elites in Ukraine had delivered in the last decades. So they hoped that a new politician would deliver something else. Because if you elect the same persons again, yeah, you can expect the same results, right? And I think similar in Belarus, we see now that many clearly have had enough of the Lukashenko and the old political elite there. And we see a new political opposition that together with protesters challenge the president. And obviously, Lukashenko is not giving up, and it's risky to protest in Belarus, as we have seen. It can be very costly for you personally, but protests still continue. So it's a strong determination there. In Georgia, it's a bit more complex. Here, the main opposition party, as Givi mentioned, the UNM, former President Mikhail Saakashvili's party, you can say he is also part of what can be described at least partly as the old elite, because the UNM has a political baggage. And as Givi mentioned, it was Saakashvili was part of the young political elite that came to power after the Rose Revolution in 2003. And many ministers were in their 30s and had no background in Soviet politics. But again, now this group is older and has a political baggage of governing. So, I mean, UNM has a stable voting base with 25-30%. And many Georgians might also be critical to the ruling party, but they are also skeptical. Some other people are skeptical to see a return of UNM and Saakashvili in power. So an interesting question, I would say, from a comparative aspect is if a new leader in opposition party from a younger generation, kind of an outsider, would emerge in Georgia, what would happen then? That's an interesting question. We don't know the answer to it, but it can be interesting to look at. Another thing I would like to mention is it can be a good idea to look at the domestic balance of power within the political arena in these countries. In Ukraine, we have always seen a balance between different groups. We have a balance between different regions, different oligarchs and political leaders. So no leader or party has been able to dominate the political arena in Ukraine for longer periods, as scholar Lucan Way has termed pluralism by default. Only one Ukrainian president has been re-elected in Ukraine since independence, and that was Leonid Kuchma in 1999. So that's very interesting, and we can see kind of a similar balance of power in Moldova, actually. All this works a little bit different. In Georgia, as was mentioned earlier, we have seen one leader and political party that kind of dominates politics for about 8 to 10 years and then loses power. But as was mentioned here, it seems now at least that the ruling party maybe remain in power for a third term, and it has never happened in Georgia before. So it will be interesting to follow now the upcoming months and years to see what will happen. Will Georgian Dream consolidate power, and what would that mean for Georgia's democratization process? We don't know, but it's something that we can look at for sure. Can I just mention one more final point before I stop? I think it's important to mention one area of similarity between all these countries, if you take the long-term perspective. And that is that politicians in these countries have generally failed to deliver a strong economic development to its citizens. Certainly, some progress has been made compared to the 1990s, which shouldn't be unfair. But if you look at which political issues people in countries such as Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine think are the most important, it is generally not about foreign policy, democratic process, or the environment or something. It's about jobs, personal economic security, the need to erase poverty, and in many cases also problems with corruption, although Georgia has done some important reforms in this regard historically. And Ukraine and Moldova, for example, often ranked as the poorest countries in Europe, and we see problems in Georgia, Armenia, and Belarus as well in terms of the economy, especially to get the people get a share of this economy as well. So I think we have the question of democratic process, as I started with, but we also have the question of output. Do governments deliver? And all this links back to if the political system is seen as legitimate by the people in the long run. So I think I stopped there. I probably took too much time, but thank you very much.
No, not at all. Thank you, Per. We have received a few questions in the chat, and I also have a few follow-up questions to all of you. I guess my first question is will follow up on some of the remarks that all of you made about the broader political development, and of course you mentioned the role of Russia. I would also like to follow up with another outside actor that has been important in a different way, the European Union. And although sort of a lot of people in Georgia support sort of the idea of joining or integrating closer with Western community, what is the opinion about EU integration, and what is the government's ability to deliver on that? Maybe you would like to start, Eto. Yeah,
sure, I can start. So at this moment, the support of EU and NATO as well is at its highest in Georgia. So people do know clearly they want to be the part of big EU family, and it has been proven by polls, by many polls in a number of times. But then there is a risk. How Russia works in Georgia is that Russia tries to discourage people from supporting EU and NATO, and that's why we have so many disinformation campaigns discrediting EU and why EU is bad, and the majority of them are taking place online. And here is where the Georgia needs the help of the West. If we do not see the clear steps from the West, kind of reassuring Georgia that the country will soon become the part of big family, people might get frustrated. It's like, I won't say that people now are frustrated, but this might come soon. So I would say that we need some clear signs from EU that the country will be joining soon. Because the Russian disinformation campaign is getting stronger and stronger, and they do know how to operate. They do know which kind of negative emotions should they fuel, and they do know which part of the society should they target. So if these campaigns become stronger, and if more and more people are influenced by these campaigns, we might be challenged by the will of not joining EU. I won't say that it might come in the foreseeable future, but here is the risk of this.
Givi, do you have any reflections on this topic?
Yes, thank you very much. I would just follow up with what Eto said, because I basically agree with everything she says. But yeah, I want to confirm that the Georgian population is overwhelmingly pro-EU integration, and also the political landscape. I would say that, let's say 80% of the political landscape, including the ruling party and the major opposition party, United National Movement, they are clearly pro-EU integration. There might be some slight differences in terms of strategies towards Russia, but as an overarching goal, so we have this entrenched in our constitution as well during the Georgian Dream rule, that Georgia aspires to become a member of the European Union and NATO. But also, I want to agree with Eto in the point that so there are quite risks here. So because Russia, of course, works very enthusiastically, there are many things that we can observe what Russia is doing here in sort of fueling anti-Western sentiments. But before that, we had some tangible goals to achieve. For instance, association agreement, DCFTA, visa-free regime, and sort of some short-run goals to achieve. But now what I fear, and what many commentators in Georgia fear, is that given that there is no clear sort of short-run or middle-run goal in terms of EU-Georgia relations, that might be frustrating for the Georgian public. And keep in mind that Russia is acting sort of very actively in terms of fueling and sort of financing some far-right groups with anti-Western, anti-LGBT sentiments. And these groups probably will continue to affect. And Eto at one point mentioned that far-right groups in these elections were sort of defeated. And this is, I agree with that, but there could be another explanation. For instance, the current ruling party, Georgian Dream party, to some extent adopted some parts of the far-right rhetoric in terms of sub-territories against Azerbaijan and things like that. So it might be the case that not only the electoral support for far-right decreased, but some support that previously voted for, let's say, some explicitly far-right groups sort of moved and transferred, and they are now sort of voted for the Georgian Dream party, some parts. That might be an explanation. So this is what I wanted to say.
Yes, sorry, I would agree with Givi that there have been some concerns in Georgia that these far-right parties might be working as a satellite parties of ruling party. There were some links between those two. For example, when one of the far-right parties, Patriots of Alliance of Patriots, they supported the presidential candidate of Georgian Dream. They have also the similar narratives which go against international organizations based in Georgia, such as NDI and IRI. So many more concerns are already raised in Georgia, in NGOs, in civil societies, in pro-Western political parties, that these two sides, ruling party and far right, might be kind of covertly in an alliance. And I agree with Givi that that might be a point as well.
Can I just mention a short thing? I think it's important when it comes to the EU. I think it's important. Well, I mean, what do we mean with EU integration, and what are the expectations? I think there are different expectations among many Georgians, and what's the expectations from kind of bureaucrats in Brussels, if you will. I mean, from Brussels side, it's a lot about reforms, kind of detailed technical things that you need to deliver from the Georgian side, and also about norms, of course. So the elections, as we see now, are important. But I think, yeah, so from the Georgian side, I think there are perhaps other expectations, and as I think both my colleagues here say, I think from the EU side, I think they don't provide an EU membership perspective, not EU membership, but even perspective. They don't say it, that Georgia has a perspective, or Ukraine or so on. So I think that EU must mix these technical aspects, which are important, of course, but they can't just say, you have to do these technical aspects, all these reforms, and that will be good for you, because that's kind of the message some deliver now. It's good for Georgia, which, yeah, maybe, but still, there must be also some symbolic kind of carrots for Georgians, I think, linked to this. So because now we have had the EU association agreement, the deep free trade area, and visa-free regimes, which are very good. Those are kind of very good symbolic steps. But what do we see now? Can we have something more also symbolic, so Georgians see that there is progress? Because you can't see that always in these technical reforms.
Yeah, and there are intermediary steps that you can take as well from the EU side, like we have integrated roaming tariffs in the EU. One could offer the opportunity for Ukrainians and Georgians, for example, to feel that they are part of that network, that when they go to the West, for example, they can use simple things like their smartphones without that being very expensive. It's a small symbolic step, but it could be at least one way of showing deeper interest from the EU side. And we have received a lot of questions regarding that. From Heinz, I got a question about how can the West pay more attention to democratization in the region? Should the EU put more pressure on the governments and the regimes in these countries than they have done previously? What is the correct strategy, you think?
I can start with that. First of all, Georgian society knows that it's their homework to advance in democracy, but they are also expecting more help and more pressure from the West, because they now feel that they have done their homework, kind of pressuring from bottom up the government to go all these democratic processes, but they do not see any results. So now they feel kind of alone, that they are only ones who are pressuring the government, and it's a red line. So it is where the role of the West comes to Georgia. Many people, not only during these elections, but before, have been waiting for some harsh statements from other kind of pressure coming from EU, because they see that they cannot do it alone. And I think that here EU might be more, might take more actions. For example, one of the things that had been discussed in Georgia right now was the sanctions of Lukashenko. And they have been saying that, okay, this guy lost elections, he stole all the votes from Belarus people, but the sanctions from EU were a bit late. And this have been concerning Georgia as well. Many people in Georgia were kind of hoping that these sanctions will come to Belarus, and it will be kind of a signal to the current government, and not only to government, but actually the oligarch who is ruling Georgia right now, because we should be kind of open in talking about this, because when we talk about Georgian politics, it goes to one person. And we might compare the situation in Georgia, in Belarus and Ukraine in these terms. So when it comes to EU help, Georgia is not only a reliable partner in many directions, and Georgia has proven it, but also a very interesting thing that is happening in Georgian information dimension is that what Russia and other actors are testing in Georgia today, that they are bringing to other countries and they are advancing. So here also Georgia might play an important role for EU to kind of share its experience. But now I think that these elections and protests and the demands of civil society should be the main area of focus for the EU in terms of making more harsh statements.
Givi, would you like to fill in, or?
Yes, thank you. So I would like to say that in Georgia, we have sort of a peculiar arrangement in terms of the checks and balances principle, because de facto, the European Union and the US first functions as a checks and balances principle of the government. And this has been the case for past 15 years, let's say. Because the electorate is overwhelmingly pro-EU, no political party has the luxury to neglect what the European Union says and demands. So I would say that what the European Union can do in terms of advancing and promoting more democratization in Georgia, at least, is that to raise its standards. For instance, raise the standards of evaluating electoral conduct. For instance, in 2012, those irregularities, I would say that to some extent were negligible because we had a peaceful transfer of power. But after that Georgian Dream is in power for 8 years, I would say that the standards might have been higher here, because we have to show some progress, and we cannot evaluate the elections as we evaluated in 2012. So I would say that I expect that the Georgian Dream and the opposition parties will behave sort of like good students of the European Union, and they will comply not everything, but most of the effort that the European Union will take. So I could say that the European Union could raise standards in terms of election conduct and demand from the Georgian ruling party to fulfill it.
Thank you. You actually answered, I think, partially another question already that I got, which is about the sort of potential forces that exist behind parties. To what role can we speak about political parties in a conventional sense, and to what extent are we dealing with parties that are vehicles for specific interests? What is the role of these interest groups in Georgian politics?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, when we speak about far-right groups in Georgia and far-right parties, we definitely speak about Russia. And when people are searching for some foreign interference, it's where Russia interferes by financing these parties and groups, which are conducting all the provocations, spreading anti-Western disinformation and discouraging people from support EU and NATO. So this, I mean, many people have been saying that, okay, show us proof that it's Russia that has been standing behind those parties. There have been multiple investigations showing the links between these parties and Russia. There was also the report by Estonian intelligence service, and unfortunately, we did not see any reports coming from official agencies of Georgia. We did not see any report coming from Ministry of Interior or State Security Service indicating which parties might be in connection with Russia, which is #1 national security threat of Georgia. Our agencies are not open about it. I don't really want to go into reasons why, but the result is that our agencies do not indicate which actors are working for Russia and what should people watch out. So this area remains really problematic in Georgia.
And if we talk about the larger parties, like Georgian Dream, you mentioned, of course, a well-known oligarch in Georgia. And we talk about United National Movement. To what extent, how should we understand these parties, the dominant ones?
Yeah, I mean, as Givi mentioned before, the situation in civil society is the following. They do not really want to see United National Movement anymore, but they are frustrated with Georgian Dream as well. So there is a demand and need for the third party, someone who will come as a savior. Unfortunately, Georgians have been in need of seeing savior for many years, and now they are waiting for the third savior, which we do not see. There are many pro-Western parties that have been competing for Georgian votes during these elections, but people do not really trust them, and the vote showed it. I mean, the majority of people voted for the opposition parties in general, but still everybody is kind of frustrated that they do not see the real third power, and it's a kind of citation, what we call it, real third power, who will come and deny these two and kind of save the world. So now I will say that Georgian Dream is using this thing that people do not really want to see United National Movement anymore. And so now it's been 9 years that Georgian Dream is using these narratives that if we go, United National Movement will come back. And this works. People do not vote for Georgian Dream, but they vote against coming back of national movement. And this is a huge problem.
Can I just add one thing more to the broader problem? I mean, I think, as you mentioned, Martin, I think the weak parties is a general problem in this region as a whole, not only in Georgia. The parties are not institutionalized in the same way as we see in Western Europe, that have like parties that are 100 years old or something, which is of course not possible in these states, of course, but still. So these parties are more based. It started often by one person, one influential person or a few persons who are wealthy or politically influential in some way. And quite often they're used also for personal benefits, and they collapse after elections. This has not been the case now with UNM, but often they collapse after elections as well. So there's a high level of insecurity based on these parties, and there are many parties as well. So it's these parties are often personality driven. I think that is something that would be a good thing if these parties would be less driven by a single personality, because now we see it's still a lot about Ivanishvili in Georgian Dream and Saakashvili and UNM. I mean, still we have these kind of personality driven narratives. I think more institutionally based parties would be a very important development, but it also takes time and it's quite difficult, I think. So, but that would be a long-term goal, I think, to kind of help strengthening also the ideological base of these parties, which is not always there.
Can I add 2 sentences?
Sure.
I would like to agree with what Per said. At first glance, you could say that there are some ideological lines in terms of party competition in Georgia, because, for instance, United National Movement is an affiliated member of the EPP at the European level, while the Georgian Dream Party is an affiliated member of the Socialist Party at the European level. So you might seem that this party competition in Georgia revolves around this sort of more left-leaning and right-leaning sort of in ideological terms. But fundamentally, Georgian party competition is a competition between personalities. So we have Ivanishvili, which is an oligarch and a head of the Georgian Dream Party, but he does not take sort of any executive position. And he's sort of basically head of the party, and he does basically everything. And on the other hand, we have Mikhail Saakashvili, who was the president and sort of informal leader, because he's not a citizen formally of Georgia anymore. He's a citizen of Ukraine, and he even was not in the list of the United National Movement. I mean, the party list. The first number in the party list of United National Movement in this election was a famous singer and actor of Georgian descent, which is Bubak Kabidze. So he's not a politician. So this political commentator speculated that this way Saakashvili demonstrated that he is not going to let any politician be first in the United National Movement's party list, and that's why he appointed sort of an actor which is not a politician at all.
Could it be a way of trying to emulate the Ukrainian example, where Zelensky was a very popular public figure before he became a politician? We could mention Ronald Reagan, who became a quite successful politician in the US. Okay, I have a few other questions. One regards to coronavirus. We spoke about this in the sort of pre-seminar chat we had, but how has that influenced the political situation in Georgia? Has there been any impact of the virus? Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that COVID-19 issue was harshly seen in the narratives of government. So basically, when I talked about these Facebook takedowns and the networks which were linked to government, we saw there some fake accounts that were created in the name of a couple of doctors. So when coronavirus pandemic break out in Georgia, there emerged 3 or 4 doctors who have been briefing people on a daily basis, and people gave them big trust. So when these people, when these doctors appear on TV, everybody trusts them because they are the first source and everybody's kind of waiting for their statements. So we saw that the name of these people were put in the fake accounts to spread pro-government narratives. And it was really sad because people kind of trusted these persons, these doctors, and we saw the usage of COVID-19 issue in the pre-election period, and this was not fair as well. But all in all, people have been frustrating with the government approach to the pandemic. We did not see people get tested, and that was the reason why we had a low number of infected during the first wave. If you don't test people, you don't get numbers, right? It was the approach in Georgia, unfortunately, that we saw. Then there was a big lockdown that hit economy harshly. All of the entertainment places were locked down, and people, of course, were not happy because they were left without any source of income. So this also hit the popularity of ruling Georgian Dream. I don't know, Givi, if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, thank you. I would add just very briefly that we have to distinguish the period before September and after September. Before September, the epidemiological situation in Georgia was quite peaceful, I would say, and the government sort of had this narrative that they managed to contain the virus quite successfully, and they tried to proactively associate with sort of a successful handler of the virus. And they used this in terms of political gains because, for instance, public health officials who were in the forefront of the response to the virus, they were attending political events of the Georgian Dream. So before September, the government tried to associate itself with these successful health sort of officials. But after September, we have sort of new upshift in the daily cases. So even today, there were 3,400 new daily cases, and considering the Georgia's population, which is 3.7 million people, this is a huge number. I mean, we are in a red zone. And so before elections and after September, when the government saw that the situation was getting out of control, they tried to blame the opposition because they were gathering and they were spreading the virus. So before September, the government tried to take the full ownership of the virus and get the political gains from it. But after they sort of lost control, they tried to share their responsibility with the opposition parties and say that they are to blame. So I would say that it played a role definitely in the elections.
You can also, if I might add, you can see that there were some polls that in 2019 we had like very low numbers. I think it was like 20% or something of Georgians who said that the country was going in the right direction. And when they did this kind of in the late summer, after this kind of this successful Georgia was presented as a successful case in terms of handling the corona. It peaked to like, I don't remember exactly, but 35 or something, or quite a high increase. And that, of course, Georgian Dream capitalized on this. But I think in Georgia, it's worrying because in many ways, of course, it's worrying all over the world. But I think Georgia is also, I mean, tourism is very important in Georgia. So I think it can be a problem now, and people can travel to Georgia, and also branded itself quite heavily as a tourist destination. I mean, many people here in Sweden now ask me, maybe not now, but before the corona pandemic, they want to go to Georgia, you know, they ask me a lot of things. So, but that's something that worries me, that I hope it will not affect the situation economically too much. And we can also see one just short point is also how Lukashenko in Belarus comparatively handled coronavirus. He didn't handle it at all. And I'm not saying that was the result that led to a protest, but it was definitely a bad handling strategy.
Yeah, I'll just add one sentence to what Givi said. We saw some loud headlines in the very well-known magazines like Washington Post and Foreign Policy, etc., that Georgian government success story, how to defeat COVID-19. I mean, we saw some financed articles about how Georgian government successfully defeated pandemic and how whole world should share the experience of Georgians, but it appeared, unfortunately, to be just one of the financed articles, and in reality, the result was that we did not only defeat, but we were getting worse and worse.
Well, we can recognize the sentiment. Sweden was the target of a lot of media attention regarding the pandemic internationally in the last few months, and if that's a good thing or a bad thing, I leave to others to judge. But I have a few more questions, and I think we have time for them before we will give you a thank you for your participation. One is, of course, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which is on the doorstep of Georgia. And Georgia, you have since 2008 your own conflict where the Russian military is occupying Abkhazia and South Ossetia since 2008. What has been the how has Georgia been impacted by the recent conflict between your two neighbors, which is, well, the upflare in the existing conflict?
Yeah, I would say that the information dimension was pretty much on fire during that, because so we have ethnic minorities both from Azerbaijan and Armenia living in Georgia, and when the conflict broke up, there were many disinformation campaigns how Georgia is helping one side or another. And it was really problematic because those ethnic minorities have been going out and protesting against the government. But these all appear to be disinformation campaigns, and thanks to the quick operation of debunking this disinformation, it prevented from escalating situation in Georgia. Because if these disinformation campaigns went viral, we can't imagine what might have happened in Georgia. I guess that the protests would have increased and more ethnic minorities would have gone to the streets, and then some ethnic conflict on the ground should have happened. I mean, I would say that Georgia was in a really bad situation in the first days of the conflict in terms of information dimension.
I will add just 2 sentences. As for the immediate results, Eto already talked about it, but in terms of incorporation, the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh into pre-election period, it was, I would say, that non-existent. I mean, it was very big surprise to me that parties did not sort of pay sufficient attention to this issue, because you have a sort of very large-scale military confrontation just several kilometers away from your southern border, but it's not part of the sort of political discourse. But it might be explained by the pandemic, by the very, very hot political temperature. But as for the more long-term implications for Georgia, I would say that as a result of this deal between Russia, Armenia and Azerbaijan that was signed by Aliyev on the one hand and Pashinyan on the other, the Russian presence, military presence especially in the South Caucasus, has increased. So which is a very sort of alarming for Georgia, because Russia has military bases in 2 occupied territories of Georgia. It has a military base in Armenia, and now it will be present in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, which is definitely alarming for Georgia.
This discussion, I'm sure we could continue for a long time. There are so many dimensions. The region is changing, and the development is highly interesting, and it's surely important also for the Swedish society and our politicians and decision makers to follow this development more closely. I have received a few more questions. Unfortunately, we are approaching the limit of our time for the discussion. So I'm not sure if you can provide a digital round of applause, but I would like to thank you on behalf of the Institute, Givi, Eto, and Per, for excellent remarks and comments. It's been fascinating, and I'm glad that you could join us. I'm sure that we will return to this topic in the near future. So again, thank you very much, and to all of the attendees, thank you for listening.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.